Recognizing how experience is conditioned and conditions is very freeing. We start to recognize the impersonal nature of this conditioning. It's not me. It's not mine. It's not who I am. It's just conditions tumbling on. And in the tumbling on of those conditions, there is and can be the arising of the sense of self, which is just yet another arising, another condition that is shaped and then shapes in its turn. So we don't have to try to see this. What I've experienced in my own practice mostly is that as the momentum builds, or when I get those bursts of momentum, those bursts of continuity I spoke about the other day, sometimes in those times, the conditioning and conditioned nature is seen. Sometimes at a very intricate level, even, sometimes very clearly watching a whole pattern unfold, a habitual pattern unfold, and seeing, oh my gosh, I thought I was doing this, but then seeing, it's just created, it's just conditioned. And then sometimes even seeing the arising of wisdom, another shaper that creates the conditions for understanding and release. So Sayadaw would sometimes say these activities of mind, the Buddha called them sankharas, mental formations, volitional formations. They act, they do things, they shape. So they are shaped and they shape. And even the word sankhara um, has that two-sided meaning to it. It both means things that have been put together. Sankhara, the Pali for that means something like the making with, or something like that. And so these mind states have been put together, and they also participate in the putting together of the next moment of experience. So Sayadaw would sometimes say, get to know what these activities do. Again, it's not to have any judgment about any of it, but we get to know how certain kinds of mind states shape experience in the direction of suffering, and certain mind states shape experience in the direction of release from suffering, freedom, more ease, more peace. So the phrase Sayadaw would say is, get to know the job description of these states of mind. What do they do? What's their job? At first, we'll probably be noticing more the reactive states of mind, and maybe getting to know the job description of our reactive states of mind, what they do. Sayadaw would talk a lot about the job description of greed, because I think he had, that was his proclivity, the greedy state of mind. I talk about aversion a lot, since that's my proclivity. That's what I've seen a lot. So Sayadaw would talk about the job description of greed, and it's like, okay, I'm going to go find out what the job description of aversion is. And one of the key fundamental pieces I understood or saw in this process of aversion is that what it fundamentally wants to do is to separate me from something, to separate me from something unpleasant, whether that's by me getting away from it, the sense of withdrawal, or by the sense of needing to get rid of or obliterate whatever that thing is. It was the separation that was the underlying job of aversion. And then, it had some beliefs. Aversion believed that that separation would be productive, would lead to happiness. And it also seemed to orient me to looking to things to separate from. That was another piece of it. So those are some of the pieces I saw around aversion. And so it's useful, I think, whatever your familiar patterns, habits are, you get curious about what they do, how they shape our experience, to learn about them. This cultivates wisdom, which has its own job description. And I began getting curious. What's the job description of wisdom? What does it do? And my sense of this, and I'm not sure I really have a full understanding of the job description of wisdom at this point, but my sense is that its nature, what it wants to do, is to understand dukkha. It wants to understand how suffering is created and how release from suffering can happen. And so that's what it does. When wisdom arises, the understanding of this leading to suffering is there. And what can happen in those moments too is that wisdom will do its job of releasing that dukkha. Sometimes it doesn't release it entirely, but it creates conditions for there to be more space around a reactive pattern or habit. And so this is wisdom doing its job. I'll talk more about wisdom doing its job later today. I think I'll bring that in this afternoon a little bit. So seeing this conditionality is just one aspect of how understanding unfolds in this practice. Sometimes the understanding unfolds more around impermanence, noticing that things are just changing moment after moment. Sometimes it unfolds more around noticing how unreliable experience is. So these three key understandings the Buddha pointed to: the nature of experience is impermanent, unreliable, and not self. And the not self understanding really is the recognition of the seeing of whatever's arising is conditioned. It's not an inherent thing. It's something that's put together and something that puts something together, but it arises in dependence on conditions. It's not an inherent, solid, stable thing. So that's the kind of that's pointing to conditionality, and seeing conditionality begins to help the mind to understand this nature of experience as not me, not mine, not who I am, not self. There are a couple of things in the chat. Let's see if they're. What's the job description of delusion? I would say the job description of delusion is to obscure the nature of the impermanent, unreliable, not self nature of experience. So when delusion is present, that those are some of those beliefs around those are operating. We're taking something to be, when delusion is happening, we're taking something to be permanent, reliable, or me, who I am, something mine. There's something else in there. My mind's a little slow this morning. Yeah, sometimes delusion takes us away from experience entirely. There's I think of different levels or layers of delusion. Kind of um, the grossest or the most obvious layer is when delusion can just take us away from mindfulness entirely. And as I've said, sometimes my experience is sometimes when I'm pulled out of mindfulness, it isn't always something unwholesome. It can be the mind trying to help me understand how to relax or how to let go of something it had been holding on to. So I don't want to create the sense that it's a problem for the mind to go away, for mindfulness to go away. And I've been talking about that. That notice what's happening when mindfulness returns. That's a clue as to what's been going on. And sometimes there's wholesome things happening there. But sometimes that is a function of delusion, to simply obscure experience in its entirety. We're just checked out, kind of a dissociation almost. So that's one piece of delusion. And then there's levels or layers of delusion that are more related to our own conditioning. They're related to our conditioning from our society, our culture, our families. The kind of views and beliefs that arise around what a human being is supposed to do, how they're supposed to act, all of those things. They're essentially, I think of delusion as being kind of layers of beliefs. And these beliefs may not be obscuring mindfulness, but they are the lens through which we are meeting experience. And so that's that kind of obscuring. And so there's a level of obscuring that happens at our personal conditioning level. The simple things like what we believe is appropriate social interaction between two human beings, how close you're supposed to stand to each other, how much eye contact you might make with a stranger, those kind of things. Those kind of things are absorbed by us and they're not questioned. I think this is one of the reasons why it's so great to travel, because those kind of assumptions can get, the bubble of those assumptions can get popped. It's like, oh wow, in this culture it's very different. I feel very different in this situation. This feels very uncomfortable. And so sometimes that discomfort around something that you believe, that can be a kind of a place or a way to recognize, oh, there's a view here, there's a view. So that uncomfortableness around things, that's a kind of another level or layer of not seeing how views shape experience. And the most fundamental level of delusion, and what I'd say, kind of that deepest level of delusion, is the taking what is impermanent to be permanent, taking what is unreliable to be reliable, taking what is not self to be self. Now, I would say is the deepest level of delusion, and how delusion works. Unfortunately, mindfulness and wisdom can see this. Delusion is a pretty powerful force in the mind, but mindfulness and wisdom are more powerful. They can see through the delusion. And one last piece I'll say about this. We often don't notice that we have a view or belief or a delusion in play until something happens that it's really pointed out to us, or like that popping of the bubble of a delusion when we're in another culture or something like that, or sometimes when the delusion falls away through the mindfulness, like the seeing of the conditioned nature of experience. Like that description I gave the other day of seeing the intention of the mind heading towards anger, and then wisdom coming in and just letting it go. I had no idea that was possible. My mind had believed that anytime anger arose, or that there was that kind of person arising in my mind, that the anger would have to follow. That it was just going to happen, that there was no way for those not to happen together. But in the seeing of the wisdom, seeing it unfold, and the wisdom letting go, like the wisdom decoupled the arising of the thought and the kind of intention towards anger from the getting angry, I could see I did not do any of it. It happened. The wisdom happened. The release from it happened. And that began to kind of poke holes in my idea around how the anger was me. It's like, yeah. So this seeing of things, sometimes we recognize a delusion when it's seen clearly, when it falls away. This experience of seeing clearly, recognizing, wow, yeah, doesn't make any sense to cling to anything. We experience those moments of non-delusion, of recognizing, yeah, it would hurt to pick something up here. It would hurt to be clinging to something. Why bother? That wisdom is functioning there. And it seems so obvious, when delusion is fallen away. It seems so obvious. Why would I ever pick anything up again? And why would I ever hold on to or cling to anything ever again? It clearly creates suffering. And yet that's a condition. The seeing of that is conditioned. And, I've been humbled, I would say humbled many, many times by this sense of a seeing of something so clearly and feeling like, yeah, this is just so obvious. Why would I, I'd say the first few times I experienced something like that, it's like, oh, I figured it out. I'm never going to experience that again. And then, 20 minutes later, it's back. And it's like, I remember having the thought, well, I guess it wasn't as obvious as I thought it was, because I cannot see it right now. It seemed so obvious at the time, that clarity, that understanding, because wisdom was present. Delusion comes back. The habit of delusion comes back, obscuring these truths. And the great thing, though, about having had it fall away, is that now you can see delusion working. You can see delusion operating because you understand that it is delusion now. You understand that it is an obscuration, this movement to want to pick something up and cling to it. You can understand that as a belief, as a view, as a perspective that the mind is meeting experience through. And so at this point, we can start seeing delusion at work. After it's fallen away, there's much more clarity when it returns. Oh, this is the mind tangled up in delusion. That sounds like a good song. Tangled up in delusion. This is the mind tangled up in delusion. So yeah, there can be a a tendency to like want to get rid of that delusion again. But again, it just needs to be understood. All of these things. It's like, oh, just understand me, understand. Cultivate that wisdom, cultivate that interest and curiosity about what it is, how it works. And understanding the job description of these wholesome qualities too it's so beautiful to see how wisdom works, to see how patience and love and compassion work, what they do, how they want to act in the world. It creates such an understanding. Again, the delusion in the states of the reactive states, the delusion in aversion, the delusion in greed. When we're caught up by those emotions or those reactivities, the delusion in there is saying, I'm the only way you are going to act. Aversion thinks it's the only way that, when aversion is happening, it thinks that's the only way you're going to be taken care of. And so the beginning to see the job description of compassion, beginning to see how compassion acts in the mind, we begin to see that also has a way of taking care of us. So that begins to kind of poke holes in that belief around anger being necessary or aversion being necessary. And while it's happening, we just learn with it. We learn with what it's doing. How is it shaping experience? Honoring everything that arises, because everything can be learned with. There's no experience that's not impermanent, unreliable, and not self. So when anger is arising, and I noticed this with self-hatred, it's like at first in the arising of self-hatred, it felt like, okay, this has to go away in order for insight to arise. There's no way I'm going to get understanding into what they're talking about until self-hatred goes away. But just honoring it, just opening to it, understanding it, began to see deep insights as self-hatred arose, seeing it as an arising, seeing it as something that is conditioned. Very liberating. So there's nothing that can't be learned with, nothing that isn't pointing out the truth of the Dharma. Every experience points out the truth of the Dharma if we are open to meeting it with this perspective. Of curiosity. What is this experience? And it's so simple. It's so simple. Dawn, would you like to add anything about conditionality or job descriptions or wisdom?
I hesitate to add much to such a beautiful description. So just a couple of thoughts. To speak just a little bit about wisdom, and this is really just an alternate lens on something you've already said, Andrea. Another function I've noticed wisdom having is to understand what kind of beneficial conditions can be cultivated to engender more wisdom and more wholesome states. So it definitely cuts through the delusions that Andrea was talking about, and it can encompass this very detailed, very broad understanding of conditionality in a way that decenters the self and the self's agendas and results in a greater capacity to allow these wholesome states to emerge, to persist, and to build on each other. So, so that's one piece. And then I just saw the question about a greed type pop into the chat. So since I'm a greed type, I'll speak to that. Greed's job is to get, to want, to get, to appropriate, to gain. I'm using all different kinds of synonyms here. And it was a real breakthrough for me. This was on an early retreat with Andrea back when they were still at Jikoji, if you remember that, Andrea, where I recognized that there was greed in the very act of focusing for me. And I'm not saying this is always true for everyone. However, the habitual wanting to see, the wanting to understand was just tangled up in desire, and in a way that it wasn't radically unwholesome. It was wanting something wholesome, yet the wanting was obscuring the capacity to see and understand. The wanting was shaping experience. Whereas when the capacity to settle back and not want is there, wisdom would much more easily and naturally arise. Doesn't mean it always arises when not wanting is present. However, the not wanting itself, the non-greed, is in of itself a wholesome mind state. So maybe that's enough for now. Please feel free to add or correct anything I said, Andrea.
Thanks, Dawn. One thing I'll add around noticing greed in wanting to know, wanting to understand, wanting to focus, because I found that at a certain point, a greed for investigation, a kind of that really wanting to know, wanting to understand was part of how the investigation was happening. And at a certain point, it really felt very painful. At a certain point, it became very clear it was suffering. That greed for wanting to know or wanting to understand. And I was a bit confused because I knew that the investigation itself was helpful and wholesome, but the greed for it was making it very painful to investigate. And it was a couple-year process of learning around it. But one thing I'll say, I'll keep this kind of simple. The main piece I wanted to bring in here is, there's certain times where we may know, for instance, I knew early in my practice that I was pretty identified as being a meditator and, identified with being good at doing investigation. This is the way my mind is built. So investigation is something that came easily for me. And I could see there was a sense of self around it. But I wasn't experiencing suffering around it initially. In fact, the opposite, because the investigation of the self-hatred, the investigation of the anger, of all of the ways I was tying myself into knots, was really helping there to be an understanding around those patterns and habits. And so they began to weaken and to let go over time, those deeper patterns of anger and self-hatred. And but at a certain point, after the kind of bigger kinds of sufferings, like layers of suffering kind of fell away, the suffering that was related to wanting to understand began to be more obvious. So when there's a lot of big suffering, those major sufferings of reactivity, a little bit of clinging to the practice, some clinging to wanting to know, wanting to understand, is probably not going to be that problematic. But at some point, we'll have to notice that. At some point, we have to recognize that we are clinging to that. And I would say when you notice the suffering of it is when to start to be curious about it. The Buddha has a teaching, relying on this, abandon that. And it's a staged process. It's not just one relying on this, abandon that. It's, and then relying on this, abandon that. And so relying on, in some ways, my mind was relying on a kind of a clinging to investigation to support the abandoning of those very deeply reactive habits and patterns. And then when those fell away, it was much easier to see the suffering that was in the, that was connected with the investigation and the wanting to know, wanting to understand. So there was that, at that point, that began to be what needed to be explored. And it was a process of exploring, what does it mean to have this wanting? How is that wanting experienced? What happens when when investigation happens? When does that wanting arise? It was just an exploration of this. And at some point I recognized that it was the sense of self. I'm going to do this investigation, that where the suffering was. And investigation can happen by itself. I don't need to be in charge of that. And in fact, my mind does investigation. It's like, I do not have to be doing it because my mind will do it. So, it was kind of like picking up after the fact, identifying after the fact, I'm the one that's doing this. It's like, no, my mind was doing it. It didn't need that identification. It didn't need that sense of holding on to that as an identity. So there was a lot of learning around it. But I would say, it's when the suffering comes, when there is suffering around a clinging or an identification like that. Somebody did put into the chat to this question around, is there greed in the desire to understand? So sometimes, yes, sometimes there is greed in the desire to understand. And sometimes it's more of a wholesome desire, a wholesome wish. Wisdom also wants to understand, as Sayadaw says. Wisdom wants to understand dukkha. That's a wholesome wanting, a wholesome movement of mind. Greed wants to get in there too, and we can feel the difference. The difference becomes clear. The difference is clear when we look at it. So there's a lot in the chat. I'll just look at a few of the chats and then open it up to the questions. So there's a few of like, what is the job description of this and what's the job description of that? What I'd encourage you is to look yourself. These habits and patterns they're very predominant. They're things that come up a lot. That's a great thing to be curious about what the job description is. So what is the job description of anxiety? Be curious about it. When does it come up? What is it trying to do? Some of the questions, I think one of the questions I encouraged you to explore in the investigation piece, what purpose is this serving, begins to get at that sense of the job description of what it is. And there can be so many layers, so many layers of how it's serving, like how anxiety is serving you in the layers down is going to be probably different than how it might serve me. And so there's possibly a kind of a very deep, job description of anxiety, but there's going to be things learned on the way. So I would encourage that exploration, that investigation. Let's see. What is the difference between conditioned nature and conditioning? Now, I'm not sure there's I mean, there, I guess the nature, I would say, the conditioned nature is that whatever is arising is something that has been conditioned and tends to condition. At least the mental formations tend to condition. So whatever is arising has this conditioned nature, whether it's a body sensation, a sight, a sound, a mind state, a thought, a belief. Everything that arises has this nature to be conditioned. It also has the nature to be impermanent and unreliable. So that's what I think I meant by the nature, the conditioned nature. Conditioning is the process of this nature. It's the process that unfolds there. So, that a body sensation is met with consciousness, and then it's perceived. So there's a nature, there's a conditioning nature, essentially. I mean, the conditioning happens around when something meets the eye and there's consciousness at the eye, that thing is seen. And then the description tends to go on with when that's seen, then there's feeling and perception. It's perceived, it's recognized. When something is recognized, so all of that is more it's pretty fundamental, that conditioning of the sense bases and sense impressions. That's just fundamental. And then it tends to get more complicated once we've perceived something, once we've recognized something. Our habits and patterns around what we think that is and what we believe about it and our ideas about it come into play and shape our relationship to that. So all of this is conditioning, unfolding. There's not that big of a difference. I mean, this is a little bit of, teasing apart fine straws or something. I don't think it's, I mean, I think just notice that experience is shaped. I mean, keep the language simple. How is this being shaped? How is this being shaped? All right, then once we recognize the conditioned mind state, like being depressed or discontent or irritable, how do you get rid of this persistent, conditioned, and habitual mind state? Well, right in there is the idea that we have to do the getting rid of. We have to do that. The practice unfolds, the nature of the conditioning nature of mindfulness and wisdom is that they begin to understand those conditioned mind states. So they begin to understand depression. It begins to understand discontent. It begins to understand irritation. And it begins to understand how it affects the mind and body. It understands how it's been put together, what beliefs are happening there. So the mindfulness and wisdom begin to understand it. And it is wisdom that the job of wisdom is through that understanding, it will begin to let go of or release those habits and patterns. So it's something that happens over time. It's not something that we get to do. We don't get to get rid of these persistent, conditioned, and habitual mind states. The gradual nature of wisdom begins to allow it to release. Sometimes we see something release quickly and suddenly, like my description of the cutting the apple and seeing the intention towards anger, and the mindfulness and the wisdom being so strong in that moment that the mind just let it go in that moment. So that was a strong wisdom, seeing it in that moment. But it did not get rid of the habitual pattern of anger. It saw it in that moment. It understood something about how it was put together. It understood that it wasn't me doing it. that made it easier to be willing to watch it and look at it and learn with it in the future as it came up over and over and over again. So it's the patience is so important in working with these habitual, deeply conditioned mind states. Let's see. Well, there's a lot in here. Is wanting different from allowing? I would say yes. Wanting is different from allowing, but there can be, I would say, I mean, allowing is this receptivity, and nothing needs to be any different than it is. With allowing, there's no need for anything to change. And wanting, its nature is to want something to change. And there can be a wanting to allow, all these wholesome states, we can see the value of them, and then we start to want them. It's of course our minds do that. Of course they do. So yeah, just recognizing what's here. Again, nothing has to be a problem, and everything can be learned with everything when there's the balance of mind. And so a key here is recognizing, having the wisdom to understand when the mind is in a place of being able to receive and see and meet and watch what's unfolding, to learn with it. As I said a few days ago, if we're noticing that while trying to be mindful of something, while trying to be curious about it, to bring that sense of mindfulness and wisdom to experience, if we notice that the pattern or habit is strengthening, then that's probably not the time to be investigating or observing that particular thing. So shifting the attention to something else, shifting the attention to some more neutral kind of experience, and not with aversion to do that shift, to kind of with the understanding. I mean, there may be some aversion in that shift. Again, there's going to be mixed motivations in our minds, probably until we're fully awakened. So to understand that there might be an aversion to an experience, and also a seeing, yeah, it's not helpful to be with this right now. And so, kind of recognizing, well, there's aversion here and it's not helpful, and exploring the possibility of kind of stepping aside from that thing or shifting the attention to something else with compassion as opposed to aversion. Can that movement to change the channel happen from a sense of more compassion, even or even at least understanding, yeah, there's a wanting to get away from this happening too in this moment, and I see that it's not helpful to be doing this right now. So we have to have the wisdom to recognize when it's possible to be meeting experience in this way, and when the mind is caught so strongly that there's not enough capacity really to meet experience. I'll answer one more that I'm just seeing here. When you say everything is conditioned, is that the same as saying everything is a reaction to something? Well, I wouldn't use the word reaction there. Reaction to me has an inherent notion of reactivity, so this is language. This is my read of that word. What arises, everything that arises has been shaped by something. Everything that arises has been shaped by prior conditions, by what's happening now. So there's this kind of two-part, it's not just about what's happened in the past, it's also where our minds are right now. What's happening now is dependent not only on the prior conditions, but also on the conditions of the present moment. And, that is the way conditioning works. but I wouldn't use the language reaction. um, I mean, maybe if you're using reaction in terms of like you know, the scientific, with every action is an equal and opposite reaction. It's, just the kind of neutrality of, the description of conditioning. But I think, reaction often has a sense of um, um, something being not so helpful. So again, wisdom can condition or shape how we're meeting experience. I wouldn't call that a reaction, but it is a conditioning or a shaping there.